Today we're looking at how to factor trinomials that have a coefficient in front of the x squared term. So we call that an a value. So in 10.2, we factored trinomials that just look like x squared plus bx plus c. And in this lesson, we're going to look at some that are a little bit more complex because they have a coefficient in front of that x squared. We're going to begin by filling in some blanks. So in this first line here, we have 2x minus 3 times x plus blank, and it's going to equal 2x squared plus 5x minus 12. Well, we know we get this minus 12 by multiplying our last terms. So negative 3 times some number has to get us negative 12. Well, negative 3 times 4 is negative 12, and so that's how we know goes in this blank right here. In our next line, we have x plus 5 times blank plus 2. And that's supposed to equal 3x squared plus 17x plus 10. So we know that our first terms multiply to get 3x squared. So x times this blank is supposed to give us 3x squared. Well, x times 3x is 3x squared. So that's how we know what goes into this blank. Our next line, we have 6x squared minus 7x minus 20 is equal to 2x plus blank times 3x plus 4. So we know that this middle term right here, we find that middle term by adding the product of our inner terms and our outer terms. So our outer terms, we have 2x times 4, that's 8x. So from 8x, we have to get negative 7x. So to get all the way from 8x to negative 7x, we're going to have to multiply something by 3x to get there. So let's see, 8 minus 15 would get us negative 7. So what times 3x will get us 15? Well, negative 15 really. Well, we'd have to do negative 5. All right, let's do a couple of more. So for this one, we have 7x squared minus 46x plus 24 equals blank minus 4 times x minus 6. So for this one, we know that that first term, 7x squared, is found by multiplying our first terms in our binomial. So this blank times x is supposed to get us 7x squared. Well, 7x times x is 7x squared, so that must be what goes in this blank right here. Now let's do this one. We have 8x squared plus blank x minus 5 equals 4x minus 1 times 2x plus 5. So remember that middle term, we get that by multiplying our outer terms, which is 4x times 5, so 20x, and then combining that with our inner terms, which is negative 1 times 2x, so negative 2x. So 40x minus 2x, not 40x, I'm sorry, 20x minus 2x is 18x. So this middle term needs to be 18x. So that blank should be an 18. All right, so when we are factoring ax squared plus bx plus c, these are what you need to remember. Whenever you multiply these two binomials, these two terms right here are your outer terms and your inner terms. That's how you get this middle term. You get this first term by multiplying your first terms, right? And then you get the last term by multiplying your last terms. And then you get that middle term by adding up the middle term, the middle terms, right? And when we do middle terms, we're doing negative 2x, these negative 2x plus 15x. And that's how we got 13x. All right, let's look at an example. Let's say we want to factor 3x squared plus 7x plus 2. So we know that our first terms, 3 times 2, are equal to 6. And that our b value is 7. So we need two numbers that multiply to 6 but add up to 7. So we can do 6 times 1. So that means we have 6x and 1x. Okay? So notice that this is going a little bit differently than whenever we were in 10.2. I take that 6 times 1 that adds up to 7, and I write it like this: 3x squared plus 1x plus 6x plus 2. Notice that 1x plus 6x is this 7x. So that's how I know that I'm on my right track, is that that should be matching. So from there, I group the first 2 terms and the last 2 terms, and I factor out the greatest common factor. So this is what we ended up with the last slide. So I group my first 2 terms together, and I group my second 2 terms together. Now that I've done that, I want to factor 3x squared plus 1x. I can factor out an x. And when I factor out an x, I'm left with 3x plus 1. Now, in this grouping, 6x plus 2, I can factor out a 2, which leaves me 3x plus 1. So notice how I have a 3x plus 1 and a 3x plus 1. I can now factor out that 3x plus 1, and it leaves me x plus 2. So now I have x plus 2 times 3x plus 1. So here are your steps to factor trinomials in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c. You first find the factors of a, which is in front of x squared, times c, which is your last term, that add up to b, which is the number in front of x. So once you do that, you're going to rewrite this middle term as the sum of terms with these factors, like the factors you got in step 1. You're going to rewrite this middle term as a sum of those factors. Then once you do that, you factor the 4-term polynomial by grouping them in pairs. So you make 2 groups, and then you factor out the common monomial from each pair. And then once you do that, you're going to be left with a common binomial that you can factor out and create a new term. And then once you are finished, you can check your answer by multiplying those factors, and you should end up with a problem that you started with. So let's look at example 2, where we have 2x squared minus 19x plus 24. So first we want to find 2 terms that multiply to a times c, but add up to b. So 2 times 24 is 48. And then b is negative 19. So I need 2 numbers that multiply to 48 but add up to negative 19. So both of my factors have to be negative because this is positive. So to get a sum that's negative but whose factor is positive, I had to have both factors negative. All right, so negative 16 and negative 3 multiply to 48, but add up to negative 19. So negative 3 and negative 16 are my factors. So now what I do is I rewrite that middle term as a sum of those factors. So remember, we said those factors were negative 3 and negative 16. So I'm going to rewrite negative 19x as negative 3x minus 16x. That's all I did, is I rewrote that with my factors. And now that I have a 4-term polynomial, I'm going to create 2 groups. My first group has the first 2 terms, and my second group has the last 2 terms. Notice that I'm adding them together, and that subtraction just becomes the negative in that first term. So from here, I factor out common monomials. So in 2x squared minus 3x, and this little group here, I can factor out an x. And negative 16x plus 24, in this little group right here, I can factor out a negative 8. So when I factor out a negative 8, I'm left with 2x minus 3. So now I can factor out a 2x minus 3. And when I factor out 2x minus 3, it leaves me x minus 8. And then this becomes our final answer. Let's look at example 3. So in example 3, we need to factor 3x squared minus 20 minus 7x. So notice that this trinomial is not in descending order. So we need to rearrange those terms so that way that our b term is in the middle with our c term at the end, right? Because remember, the constant should be at the end. So we do a times c, so 3 times negative 20, which is negative 60. So we need 2 numbers that multiply to negative 60, but add up to negative 7. So I know that 12 and 5 multiply to negative 60, but they both one of them would have to be negative. So if we make the 12 negative and the 5 positive, then negative 12 plus 5 is going to end up to be negative 7. So those are our 2 factors, negative 12 and positive 5. So what we do is we rewrite that middle term with negative 12 and positive 5. So negative 7x becomes negative 12x plus 5x. So now that I have a 4-term polynomial, I'm going to separate into groups. And then once I have my 2 groups, I want to factor out my common monomial. So in this first little group, I could factor out a 3, and I can also factor out an x. So I have 3x, and I'm left with x minus 4. And then in this grouping, I can factor out a 5, which leaves me 5 times x minus 4. So notice that I have x minus 4 as a common binomial. So I'm going to factor out x minus 4, which will leave me 3x plus 5. So I factor out x minus 4, and I'm left with 3x plus 5. So remember, the first step in factoring a polynomial is to factor out any common monomial factors. Sometimes we will get a trinomial in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c, where it's not as complicated as we think it is. All we have to do is factor out a common monomial first, and then try to factor. So let's look at example 4, where we're going to see that there's a common factor of 2x. So in example 4, we have 12x cubed minus 20x squared plus 10x. So I have a common factor of 2, because 2 will go into all of those. And I also have a common factor of x. So I'm going to pull out a 2x. So 12x cubed divided by 2x is 6x squared. Negative 20x squared divided by 2x leaves me negative 13x. 10x divided by 2x becomes 5. So from here, now I need to factor this trinomial. So my a is 6 and my c is 5. So I'm looking for 2 numbers that multiply to 30, but then they have to add up to negative 13. So I know that 6 and 5 multiply to 30, but I don't think they will add up to negative 13. Let's see, I know 10 and 3 multiply to negative 30, and in order for we have to add up to a negative number but multiply to a positive, both of them have to be negative. So we'll have negative 10 and negative 3 So negative 10 times negative 3 is positive 30, but negative 10 plus negative 3 is negative 13. So that's going to work. So our two factors are negative 10 and negative 3. So I'm going to replace this middle term, this minus 13x, with negative 3 and negative 10. So here was the negative 13x, and it became negative 10x minus 3x. So from here, I'm going to create my two groups, right? We're going to have those two groups being added together. So here's my first group, plus here's my second group, and notice that that subtraction goes with that first term, and see how that they're being added together. So I need to factor out common monomials. So if I have 6x squared minus 10x, I can factor out a 2 and an x, leaving me 3x minus 5. And in this little binomial group here, I can, I don't think I can factor an x out, but I could factor out a negative 1, and that would leave me 3x minus 5. So now I have a common binomial. I have 3x minus 5 and 3x minus 5 that I can factor out. That will leave me 2x minus 1. So here's this 2x. It just came down for the ride. I factored out this 3x minus 5, and it left me with 2x minus 1. So from here, this is as far as it will factor. We can go ahead and lose the extra set of parentheses, though. We don't need those. Okay. So let's do this example. So this one has the y at the end. So just remember that your terms need to have a y in them. So AC is 2 times negative 14, so it's negative 28, but they had to add up to 3. So factors of negative 28, whose sum is 3, making sure that I remember the x and the y. So negative 28, I think 4 and 7. And if we make the 7 positive and the 4 negative, that will add up to positive 3. Okay, so we're going to replace 3xy with 7xy minus 4xy, which is what we did here. And then I'm going to separate into two groups that are being added together, right? So I have 2x squared plus 7xy, that's my first group, plus this negative 4xy minus 14y squared. Notice that that subtraction just went with the first term here. All right, so from here, I'm going to factor out any common monomials. I know I can factor out an x here, leaving me 2x plus 7y. And then over here, I can factor out a negative 2, and I can also factor out a y. So I'm going to factor out a negative 2y, and I'll be left with 2x plus 7y. So notice that 2x plus 7y is a common binomial that I can factor out, which will leave me x minus 2y as my other factor. All right, go ahead and try some problems on your own.